love this place!
Look at these two pieces of art. They're both from the upcoming D&D 2024 Player's Handbook. One captures the spirit of fantasy at its best, while the other is, well, something entirely different. Wizards of the Coast has been releasing more and more of the artwork from the 3 core rulebooks in the run-up to their release. I must say that I don't really like what I see so far. It's not very inspirational. Now, there are a few gems, but far too many pieces are either full of technical errors, soulless, or, quite frankly, are full of agenda. Now, of course, this is the piece that's actually making big news lately. Congratulations, orcs. According to a bunch of leftist kooks, you apparently graduated from representing blacks to now becoming hard-working people who like tacos, El Caminos, leaf blowers, and rosaries. The good news is that picking up henchmen in your campaign just became a lot easier. Just make sure the party is at the Waterdeep Home Depot at 6 a.m. This image even seems to have caused a lot of head-scratching from normie gamers, who were probably already on the fence as to whether they needed to pay $200 for an update that's fully compatible with their old stuff. But lost in this whole Latin orcs fiasco is a determined plan by Wizards of the Coast to show that the future of gaming, as they see it, is fat, gooey, and female. Yes, that's right. That is an actual piece of art from the Player's Handbook. Look, all kidding aside, when we see pictures like this, our minds sense a disconnect. It doesn't sit right with us. When we see a female warrior ever so often, nobody really gives it a second thought at this point. We remember reading of and then seeing the bravery of Éowyn in Lord of the Rings. We loved Belit and Valeria in the Conan stories of Robert E. Howard. But they were not ubiquitous. They weren't everywhere all the time. Warriors from biblical times up through today have predominantly been men. It's just a fact. So when we're subjected to non-stop women warriors and adventurers, almost to the exclusion of men, something feels a little bit off. And look, I understand that art styles change over the years. Errol Otis, David Sutherland, and Dave Trampier are nothing like Brom, Clyde Caldwell, or even Wayne Reynolds. Yet even as the times changed, we recognized that what we were looking at was still fundamentally D&D. It was still fantasy. Even if some of us may have preferred some of the older art, we could still appreciate the new stuff. I'm not sure what much of this stuff even is that you're seeing behind me. It's not D&D, that's for sure. Some of it is competent, but belongs elsewhere. Wizards of the Coast is not trying to increase the role of women in D&D. They're doing nothing less than trying to supplant men in D&D's visuals. They didn't choose these images by accident, after all. I said in a prior video that D&D is founded on masculine principles. Like it or not, the game has its roots in Napoleonic war games and medieval combat, the military. Wizards of the Coast can try to run from those roots as much as possible, but you can't change where you come from. This game is about killing, bloodshed, vengeance, and glorious treasure. Those are, generally speaking, not feminine things. D&D is not strictly a feminine game. And yet women have always played it, since the very first games of Blackmore. The Seattle companies like to lie to us now and say that women and minorities were somehow excluded. They weren't. It's just that women that played all the way up until these last few years understood what they were playing. They didn't want the game they loved humiliated with fat elves and bisexual lighting, goofy villains, socialist cities, and foodie night markets. They watched those 1980s fantasy movies too. And they probably read Howard, Tolkien, Lieber, Cook, Weiss, and Hickman. And they were inspired by it. But there's not much that's inspirational in these newly released images. They don't make you want to split skulls, steal riches, or become a king by your own hand. They might make you want to curl up with a blanket around a bunch of scented candles, maybe take a soak in some lavender bath salts. Wizards of the Coast is on record as saying that they don't particularly care for white men. They've given explicit instructions to their artists, not just in this current rules update, but from the beginning of 5th edition, to not portray white men.
When we got the descriptions, they were very adamant. They were like, try not to make it like a white blonde guy. Like, please, like, we love them, but there's like 500 million of them.
The diversity that the characters need to have needs to reflect the gaming world now. The mix of people that are playing these games, you know, it's not, you know, 13-year-old white boys held up in their basement. It's a very diverse crowd, you know.
Wizards of the Coast will gladly take your money as they try to change the very perception of what it was you fell in love with about the game. We did see what they're capable of with that excellent Dragonlance piece and a couple others. But those should be the norm. They should not be the exception. And right now, they are the exception. As I stated, these are the images that Wizards of the Coast is highlighting. Wizards of the Coast is selling a book for $100, celebrating the 50th anniversary of D&D. Yet they didn't even bother to consult with Rob Kuntz, the last creator left from the early days who knew both Dave and Gary. People like Rob are a nuisance to the cultural fanatics at Wizards of the Coast, because his version of D&D is our version. Current D&D is full of cooking contests, festivals, pastel colors, all led by Mommy, who definitely needs to lay off the lembas bread. I guess the question is, can Wizards of the Coast change the perception of what D&D is? Well, let me ask you this. If the New York Yankees took the field on opening day next season and instead of their classic pinstripes, they were wearing hot pink uniforms with white polka dots, would you scratch your head a little bit? Would you feel that was a little jarring? Maybe you might even think it's downright silly. Old fans would never forget what they were, and would most likely never accept them in anything other than pinstripes. But new fans might get used to the polka dots. Maybe the team decides that they don't need all the money that they take in. They can afford to lose a certain percentage of their business. Maybe they think there's more money by appealing to the polka dot crowd. Will it work? I suppose we'll see. I can only say that the strategy hasn't worked for comics, and it hasn't worked for companies like Disney so far. We'll have to see how the launch of the new core rulebooks works for Wizards of the Coast. These are fanatics we're talking about here, and they are Marxists to varying degrees. So losing money does not matter to them, provided there is still money to lose. I guess it comes down to, will you give them more money to lose? If you're a woman, I can definitely see why you would. The cooking contest, dinosaur racing, and non-stop parties might be appealing to some of the newer players. But don't delude yourself. It's no longer the same game many of you fell in love with. It's been subverted and vandalized by selfish idiots. These are the same types of people that raided the Roman Colosseum for building materials after the Empire fell because, well, they were too lazy and stupid to figure out how to do it on their own. And I really think that sums up the team behind Wizards of the Coast right now. Lazy and stupid with a streak of viciousness inside of them. Some hide it through smiles.
There are materials in original Dungeons & Dragons that would never pass our inclusivity reviews today. And a lot of it is, some of it you can understand. Like, okay, these are a bunch of war gamers, and they're using armies from history. And so when they create a warrior class for Dungeons & Dragons, they call it the fighting man, right? Because that's what they were used to, and they were all men. They were all white dudes from Lake Geneva and the Twin Cities. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Like, there's a lot of material in this book, and I won't go over all of it, but it would not pass our inclusivity reviews today.
Others show open disdain for the customers that help keep them in business. You are, of course, free to decide whether you support the new edition of D&D or not. If, like so many others, you're troubled by what you're seeing and hearing from Wizards of the Coast these days, remember that there are options. If you're in a 5e game, I completely understand why you maybe don't want to switch. But if you're in between campaigns, look at some other companies and creators out there. There's Dragon Slayer by our friend Greg Gillespie for an old-school homage that's compatible with decades of material. There's Castles and Crusades for a rule set that's kind of a missing link between 2nd and 3rd edition D&D. If you like more historical games with a twist of fantasy in them, there's Baptism of Fire by the RPG Pundit and Maquahital by the Basic Expert. Now, if you prefer the 5th edition rules but don't want to support Wizards of the Coast, you can always try Shadow Dark, which I view as sort of a second cousin to 5th edition. The creator there is a woman who understands the defining principles of D&D and embraces them instead of bending them to a certain worldview. There are so many options out there and so many players desperate to play that I think it'll be easier to switch than you might think. Well, thanks to all of you. Tell me what you think about Wizards of the Coast's new art in the comments below, won't you? Do you agree that there's a bit of agenda in them and some of them are just not technically good pieces? Or do they match your style? Do you like them? I'd love to hear from you. Remember also, every Wednesday at 7 p.m. is our weekly live stream, The Lair. We would love to see you guys there. Well, that's all for now. You guys have a great rest of your day, and until we talk again, goodbye.